Hi, I'm Tom Richardson, BookNet Canada's, classification whisperer, here to give a ramble through subjects. If there's time and interest at the end, I have some data about Thema use and quality pulled from BiblioShare I can go over. I don't know if how the timing will work, or if there's kind of interested. It's not necessarily. It's interesting to see the data actually in use, and that figures in my presentation. Anyway, it's also hard to discuss the specifics of subjects without touching its distribution. ONIX is designed to support online display for consumers, but sections of metadata have different target audiences and intent. So product supply, or the supply detail, is almost entirely used by retailers internally. Probably the only values typically displayed to consumers are price. On the other hand, marketing collateral, or the other text composite, is typically designed to be read by consumers. Though ONIX 3.0 allows you to specify other target audiences, and 2.1 does support specialized text codes for them. Now, 3.0's descriptive block is harder to define in 2.1 as a unit, but both are largely the same and in the same order. It's product form, collection or series set, title, author, and so on down the ONIX tree, down to subject, audience, and complexity. In terms of who uses this material, it's a mix. Much of it is displayed to consumers, but all of it is critical to your trading partner's knowledge of the product. Virtually all of this section is identified by the North American best practices as mandatory or mandatory if applicable. If marketing collateral is the sales pitch, the descriptive block is the section that most defines the book as a saleable object. I like to be simple sometimes. ONIX is used for database-to-database communication. You send it, someone else processes it to take away what they need from it. And this is why best practices exist. Every part is neither used nor sent, and what is varies by company. A best practice document should represent what's typical and most likely to be needed or sent, which should be supported by industry consensus. There isn't a trading partner who matches every part of that consensus, but most come close. Now, this grouping of metadata values are typically considered together by end users, used extensively as business knowledge, and because of that, some of these are likely to be changed by third parties and unlikely to be displayed directly to consumers. Because this block supports some specific business needs that relate to subjects, I'm going to quickly review the rules on them. Okay, consumers never see audience. It's used by professionals to organize books as their specialities are typically organized. You use a single trade code to make that breakout easy, and providing more than one can mean that you're excluded from a select like all minus adult. So choose one and know that the user actually understands crossover products. The education audience codes are used to identify books for those special markets, and they are used by a different group of professionals. Generally, these codes are not used in conjunction with trade audience codes, but where legitimate, audience codes can repeat to support a book that's both trade and has specialized audiences. Functionally, that means in ONIX, you can repeat the audience code. It's wrong to repeat it for trade books, and it's okay but atypical to include a trade code and an education code. You're allowed to do something, it's a bad idea. Okay, audience range. I hope everyone knows this. It's mandatory for all juvenile and YA books. Focused ranges, no more than 3, maybe 4 years. And if you really must, you should use from 14 without an end age. So never 0 to 99 as a range. Now, I've added complexity here, mostly to cite this really excellent white paper that you should have on file and read. And also note that it contains a very excellent educational taxonomy, which is a recommended word list, that's very useful for keywording educational books. You can actually leave now because this explains everything. Subject coding explains what the book is about. And you shouldn't complicate it. If somebody does a subject search and pulls down your title, they should be able to find information on that subject in your book. Or in the case of fiction, a clear relationship exists between the subject and your book. I'm not covering keywording in this webinar, but one basic part of it is that if the subject code system doesn't cover something important about a book, it's a potential keyword. And it's worth stressing that there is no need to duplicate subject terms in your keyword block. But I did want to include these citations, just in case there's any confusion. TF is, of course, tech form, so there are tech form presentations that you might want to see. And we've been blogging an awful lot recently about keywording, so definitely check out our blog. Now, retailers will index your records. That means that they create tables of values associated with a book, your book, that work in the search bar. And they usually support separate subject or age select functions. Searching would include title and author and might include some terms in the description. It probably includes the subject values themselves the subject values that you selected as well. Amazon would include your keywords. To the best of our knowledge, no other retailer is using them at the moment. So looking at the list of that I just had up, complexity data, reading levels, particularly from a commercial source, are almost certainly displayed unchanged if they're going to be used. Audience ranges, though, are likely to be forced into specific ranges specific to the site you're on. And I've actually heard that retailers like to use standardized sources like Baker and Taylor more than those sourced from publishers. It's a regular complaint. What do you think controls if a children's book, what do you think controls if it's a children's book on a retail site? The main subject or the audience code? It's a double trick question. They should be a matched pair, representing the same functional value in your data. But my guess is that the retailer buyer confirms your choice and overrides it if it's necessary. The point is, processing varies. Test, ask questions whenever you have an opportunity, and look at the results of your metadata distribution. Erica Liebman's 2017 tech forum presentation just cited is a really extreme example of testing. But by testing your data, you confirm the results online, and it's part of good metadata. Subjects are processed too. And I just noted may be modified by the retailer system, so they are hard to test. That makes it even more important to match retailer expectations in processing to increase the chance your data is used properly. There is no hierarchy in book subjects. If it applies, it should be used. How do you rank or order that? Why would you? But retailers typically organize their buyers by subjects, so there's a convention in trade subject classification that one subject is designated as main. Main subject is always a subject code, not a region, merchandising code, or any other qualifier list. It's a subject code. And it is always a single code for each book record. Everything else is just a subject code. And those can include all types. But there's a very specific Thema need for main subject that I'll get to in a moment. And hey, I just mentioned Thema for the first time in what, 20 minutes? Okay. Technically, I should have included BIC in this list, but BIC has formally adopted Thema ongoing, so BIC subjects are in a sense a legacy system. But basically all I'm saying here is these are the systems that are specifically intended to support consumer retailer sales, and therefore are trade subject schemes. Anything I've said to this point applies equally to both systems, but I should put BIC subjects into perspective. BISAC is the dominant subject system in North America, and it is fully supported by all retailers working here. The BISG Subject Committee is well established, diligent, and focused on maintaining BISAC subject classifications in support of what sells today. If your goal is to describe consumer sales by book subject using the fewest possible codes, BISAC is by far the best system available for North America. Nobody ever comes to me for optimistic sounding statements, but there's a reason I want this clear. There's not a lot of retailer end user processing of Thema metadata in our primary market yet. So even where you know a retailer uses Thema elsewhere, they will still tend to process regional data, like North American data, by the norms of that region. I would not assume Kobo is processing Thema unless they have told you they have. But it is used internationally, very extensively, particularly non-English internationally. It is definitely used by Amazon in Europe. It is being used in the UK to replace BIC. It is being used. This is a strong statement. BookNet Canada recommends using Thema because it provides superior national codes for Canada and because it's different. Thema's strength lies in describing the book's subject. If BISAC is ideal for describing where a book currently fits in the North American market, Thema excels at describing a book's subject. It has a much richer syntax available, can define time and geography accurately. And if you look at them and their strengths, BISAC and Thema are actually pretty complementary systems. And that's how I explain why you'll need to support both for the foreseeable future. It's good. It's good to have two systems. And Thema has potential. It has real potential in terms of being a better system for describing books. Okay, BISAC has developed rules to make data predictable. Remember processing? Processing means that the end user has to be able to predict how you're going to use it, and that's why over time these rules have developed. They should be familiar. Never mix adult, juvenile, and YA codes, one type per record. Never mix fiction and nonfiction codes. There is no formal limit on the number of entries, but don't use more than 5. Fewer are the normal expectation. Thema, well, no one is processing Thema seriously yet, so we don't have an awful lot of feedback on the processes that retailers may be having interpreting it. But if a code applies, it can be used. So in the example I have on screen, if it's a novel, heavily themed for technology or aviation or espionage, which has some excellent codes available for it that are not actually within the fiction list, you might well use those codes to express that theming. It's not complicated. You can use codes however you want to use codes. So I consider this to be a necessary processing rule. Thema has to have a main subject. This is completely compatible with the retailer need, but if you mix code types, you have to support a single subject main subject. I'm sorry, that's really badly phrased. You need a single main subject code to clearly identify what the book is. And you can't have some books with a main subject and others without a main subject. So you need to provide a single subject code to act as a primary identifier on all books. Qualifier lists qualify subjects, so they can't be a subject. They do not belong in the main subject. One code, that's the rule. Now, these are a little less clear as rules go. Although the second one, use the most specific code possible, is a carryover in effect from BISAC, and it should be taken as the most gospel of all these rules. But this is mainly for retailer information. You should expect to see an awful lot more codes in Thema than BISAC. 10 is not actually an unreasonable number to reach when you start adding up qualifier lists and verbose time values and a variety of other things. The recommendation will always be to use the fewest possible codes possible, because that's simpler and clearer. The most specific code is always best because codes are hierarchical. The subject may not be a hierarchy of subjects, but the code itself includes values above it. So everything on the fiction list is of necessity a fiction book. The retailer can tell that. There's no confusion around that. So the most specific code used, particularly as the main subject, provides the retailer with the most information. So use the fewest codes, rely on the code's hierarchy, and you can't really go wrong. That's basically my presentation in a nutshell. We have some well-developed pages on our website to guide you to all sorts of values. I used less time than I expected for this, so that's actually good. You don't expect to memorize that link. There's some sites that you can join in order to get more information about Thema. You can contact me via Biblio at BookNet Canada. There is a implementation group just for Canada, where you can, in theory, consult with your peers, get notifications and more. It's not being used an awful lot right now, but that's what it's there for. A good place to post questions, because I can pretty much guarantee there are other people having the same problems if you're having the problems. And there is a Canadian English language working group for Thema. It's chaired by Julia Horrell. It's run out of the BookNet offices under BookNet's auspices and under, I guess, the tutelage of the Bibliographic Committee. If you're interested, you should consider joining it. Now, what I was planning to do at this point was go freeform, which is a very scary thing for anyone in the right mind to do in the middle of a presentation. But what I was just going to do is there are resources that are being cited. For example, this is the link that I provided. There's the basic page. Various things are cited here that are available for your use. First of all, Editor, the same group that organizes Onyx, is responsible for Thema, and its documentation is steadily improving, and I expect to improve to the same insanely high level that Onyx has. It's already very, very good, but there is a simple 5-page document that explains how to use Thema. It's excellent. You should use it. There is a mapping from BISAC to Thema. I'll actually bring it up in a moment. The one problem with it right at the moment is, as you're probably aware, Thema is now at version 1.3. BISAC is at version 2017. Yeah, 2017. And unfortunately, the mapping from 2017 to version 1.3 isn't available yet. I actually hope to have it available for announcement and as part of this, but it's due kind of anytime, hopefully soon. So the one warning is about the mapping is it's not necessarily completely up to date. If you're involved in the French language, BTLF is your resource for Thema. There is a separate French language group within Canada for Thema. It's one of the great things about Canada. We can have two groups to do the same thing. And actually, when we go over some of the lists, you can see some of this. Now, Editor supports this lovely and very useful browser. So this is what you would see when you first sign in. Now, one of the reasons why I don't have a slide for the main subject headings of Thema subjects is it's here. I mean, you don't have to work very hard to find it. As you can see, The notation is along the left. It's a letter-based system. You can expand by clicking on something. Here's the breakdown of the arts. If there's dots, it means you can expand it more. AB, arts, general issues. AF, fine arts. It's all, and so on. So when I say the codes are hierarchical, A is included in paintings and painting, and so is fine arts, because it goes C, F, A, all the way up. It's not complicated. It's a very straightforward, simple way of looking at the data. Retailers should understand it. If there are questions, what I would really like to know is what problems people are having with Thema, because people seem to want these webinars, but no one ever tells me what problems they're having. So again, the implementation group is available for that purpose. You not only get your peers, it's a direct line to me. We want to help people figure these sorts of things up. So, I mean, if you're having problems, you don't understand how to find something, I'm going to show you a different way in a moment too, but this is particularly hell. I mean, this is one way of doing it. Put a search terms in. Okay. Regency appears under historical romance. And it should appear as a time period as well. I'm sorry, because there we go. Right. So it's a type of historical romance, and it is a time period. I guess they haven't fully updated this thing, because it actually appears in one other place on the list, and that's in the style list, which is a 1.3 edition. So that's interesting. I wonder, as you can see, it needs full terms. Okay. There you go. This is why you don't want to like just do things freeform. It's because when you have something to say, you don't always get it to. I'm going to pull over to my spreadsheet, because I actually prefer to use the spreadsheet. And the reason I prefer to use the spreadsheet, I'll just show you, is okay. To see the notes, you need to hit the little button over here to see this controls something else. What does that control? You click on that to reveal all the notes linked to the categories. This is a sheet that editor has provided in order to explain how to do things. There's lots of stuff to help you use these things, and you should make sure that you get it all and have it available. So this reveals all the notes to link categories, so using that should lead this thing to be open at all times, and I'm not sure why it didn't. There may be a browser difficulty involved. Anyway, one of the reasons why I like using the spreadsheet is because it just has all this stuff available when I do things normally. Now, the trick I was just trying to show you about Regency was something I just did in here. Because I was trying to think of problems you're going to be having. There is a time period available for Regency, which is, as you can see from the code that's right here, hopefully you can see that it's highlighted, 3ML-GB-PR. What that means is code list 3, we'll go over this a bit more generally in a moment, but this is a good example. Code list 3 is time. ML is a time zone period, the 19th century. Great Britain, GB, also known as the UK, chose for one of its codes to have a group called Regency, 1811 to 1820. So there's a specific time period within British history that they've identified specifically as being Regency. That's a choice that they made as a national group. The next place we can find Regency is in code 6, where a code was added in version 1.3 for Regency. Now, my question is, if you have an historical romance, and it's a Regency romance, which code do you use? Do you use the style code, or do you use the time period code? I don't know the right answer. Offhand, I would advise anyone to probably take, if your book is set in Great Britain, in the period that is called Regency and is either slightly ill-defined or between 1811 and 1820, that you should absolutely use the time period code because it is clear, concise, and really means what it is. And if you have a steampunk novel that's playing a riff off historical romance and it's kind of Regency themed, I would use style. So again, I would go a bit by the content, but we don't really have a great system in place to specifically say how to use the style list versus anything else. So let's take a slightly larger view than that. We've already seen the subject headings, so let's just quickly go over the qualifier lists. So the subject headings list, as you can see, there's about 3,000 of them. That's quite comparable to the number that are in BISAC. One of the hallmarks of a trade subject classification system is you try to have as few codes as possible because, frankly, it's being used by untrained people trying to work with materials like this, and you don't want to have too many codes. That's one reason it's done that way. Now, one of the special parts of Thema versus BISAC is BISAC also supports a separate region code, but it's much more generalized. The special thing in the qualifier lists that allows Thema to be a lot more expansive is certain qualifier lists are allowed to have country codes in them, and that's where the national group chooses to have specific codes added to a list. Fabulous innovation. It allows each country to have things. They can be added to list 1, geography, list 2, time. I've got some things to say about that in a moment, but list 2, time. They're not allowed in list 3, language, because how do you make a national qualifier to language? No, you should just have a language code. List 4, education, can have them. List 5, which is interest groups, and there'll be more to say in a moment on that, can have them, but not list 6, style. So let's just, taking this along slightly, let's have a look at the most important subject code, national group that we can possibly cite here. So it's a bit tricky to find them, but anything marked with a -CA is, of course, Canada. Now, as you can see, is by putting one of the things I just did there is I'm in filters. Again, to take a step back, BookNet Canada believes that you can never give too much information about using Excel. There's always somebody who doesn't understand some portion of Excel. So I am looking at my Excel spreadsheet using filters, which is part of the data group, and it's this big filter thing, and it allows me to get this sort of thing where there's a drop-down available where I can select things, and also allows me to use these things along the side to isolate very specific things. So I can isolate everything with a -CA. I can isolate the entire list of Canadian national codes into a list simply by doing this. Now you notice that 1 KBC Canada is not listed. That's because it's not a national code. It's actually just a code that's part of the overall list. So 1 KBC is the code for Canada, and conveniently enough, the national codes are a tree underneath it. So any national code includes Canada. Go figure. Hierarchy. It's your friend. So here's your national codes, and as you can see, there's a lovely breakdown by province. by different parts. This is a very ad hoc sort of creation. I'm partially responsible for it. It came out of committee work about 4 or 5 years ago. We tried to divide the country up as much as we possibly can. That means that British Columbia, which has an incredibly well-defined set of codes, has a lot of codes available. And that's because British Columbia had a self-identified list of them available. For other countries like Alberta, they were what we could identify from sorts of things that do. Or worst case scenario, we try to kind of at least include climatic zones. So pretty much any national park is included in this list because we figure they are tourist attractions and usually give a grouping of a sort. It's good for tourist books. And climatic zones. British Columbia, which has a great list, and actually specifically has a great list because they regard each one of these valleys as a climatic zone. So that's one of the reasons why they have it. Go figure. When you get to Manitoba, you know, there's not a lot of national parks. It's a gigantic province though, so we at least have it split up northern, middle, and southern. So that's the least we do in pretty much every case. If you have a need, you could propose another code, and it could be added through the auspices of the working group that comes out of BookNet Canada. You can contact us, and we'll try to make it happen as soon as possible. It's that easy. It's easy to get a code added. That's why this is an improvement. Now, when you're working down this list of other national codes, which is kind of an interesting way to look at things. Language, as you can see, actually does contain some Canadian codes. I'm sorry, time. List 2 is time. It does actually include some Canadian codes, but they were chosen by the French group.
I'm just going to jump in here with a question from Sherry. So for location codes, do you use it specifically for where the book is set, or could you use it for where the author is located?
What an excellent question. Onyx 3.0 supports in the contributor composite something called subcomposite, actually called contributor place, and it allows you to specify for each contributor the country, Canada, the province, region, which you can do in 2.1 as well, but it also adds a third thing, location, which would be intended to be the city where the contributor can exist. And as I said in the original presentation, Thema is a subject code system, and subjects are what a book is about. So basically, no, you can't explain anything about the author, where they live, they died, or anything else about them, unless they actually put it in the book, and it's kind of a clear grouping within the book. Now, having said that, most Canadian authors write about what they know on some level, and generally speaking, Canadian authored books will be set often in Canada. And the one thing I can sort of say is the book should be in as specific an area to Canada as it possibly can. I mean, if it's largely in the prairies, call it the prairies. If it's if it's in a city, most cities have a location code within the, at least major cities do. You should be identifying the book as specifically as possible. People will be able to see it's in a Canadian book from the code, but authors, the actual author, not particularly relevant as to the book's subject, where they live, or anything else. If that isn't clear, or people are unsatisfied with it, because people want regional codes to be something else. I mean, this is actually came up when I checked up BiblioShare data, that people have classified an awful lot of books as Canada, and I don't know why. I mean, why would you, how could like over 50% of the use of regional codes in BiblioShare be for the region Canada? I mean, surely most of these books are a little more specific than that. Why are people, what's driving this use of the Canadian code. My guess is people are trying to identify it as a Canadian book and not a book about Canada or a book set in Canada. Again, when it's nonfiction, maybe it's just to like rephrase this slightly again, when it's nonfiction, it really should be, if you're giving a region, focused on that region, shouldn't it? I mean, the region should mean something. When it's fiction, though, it's a looser sort of use case. I mean, if the book's set in Toronto or Southern Ontario, or just feels like it, or the author says, yeah, that's kind of where it is, even though it's not clearly identified, I'd say you should be using a specific code in it. I mean, if it's suburbia, North America, maybe that's when you use North America code, but I would say that's a good time to use keywords, not to use a regional code, really. Again, we should be writing the rules on this. We should be having discussion on this. Excellent thing to bring up on that forum that exists for this purpose. Here's the book. Here's why I think it needs a code. What does everybody think is a great discussion point to have. I was just being confused because I, of course, work by memory when you freeform. List 1 is definitely geography. List 2, okay, list 2 is language. And I never realized this. I always thought that list 2 did not allow to have national codes, but actually, apparently it does. And I actually was part of like Acadian French, so there you go, I even knew this. It's atypical to have language codes, subgroups, but we actually do have subgroups in Canada. You know, Quebecois is a definite subgroup of, I believe this, yeah, I'm just gonna take the filter off. Right. Here's the language code, Canadian French. This is why you need actually subcodes. Then there's Canadian French, which is in theory Quebec French, but then there is Acadian French, and then there's Quebecois French, and they are in a sense distinct subgroups. So in effect, we do need to have language codes, and this is why, because we do have a code for Canada, but it's not actually subtle enough for the reality of Canadian language. There you go. You see, you use the list and you discover things. So language is 2, 3 is time, and you definitely can get subgroups in time. Now, the reason I kind of question this sometimes is I think that some of these things are very useful. Sweden having the Viking Age is probably a very useful thing, and it's also a very weird time frame. It would take an awful lot of codes to get that time. But there are some other things that I find kind of, I don't know, confusing. American Revolution, absolutely. I mean, this is a US code, makes perfect sense. They write a lot about it. They need that code. But you get to the 20th century, moving down this thing. And let's just find, I don't really understand, given that the code groups are by decade, or can be by decade, and why the USA has something called the Great Depression. Okay, it does go from 1929 to 1939. It isn't quite the decade. But, I mean, when you put this sort of label on it, does that mean that this code should only be used for books about the Depression, or should this be used, I mean, if it's a financial book that in a sense is studying finances, I mean, and when you get down to the Jazz Age, okay, again, it's 1919 to 1929. Really? Do we need this? Anyway, Canada has very few time codes set up for it. And that's because when we set up to do so, like the US trying to find some groupings like this, immediately BTLF came down like a ton of bricks on the English language code groups because they weren't right. They were wrong ostensibly from Quebec's point of view. And that's actually, unfortunately, a truism about Canada as a thing. Time period in BC is not the same as time period in Ontario. Time period in Quebec is definitely different from other time periods in this country. We're a big stinking country. different areas have different needs. So there has been a conscious decision by the Canadian English language group to not really worry about setting up time periods. Now, was that a good decision? If you need them, you should talk to us, because you might need them. Maybe you feel really bad that you have to go to the Weimar Republic to get some things. Maybe you think the USA Progressive Era is useful. I don't know. I mean, at least that's 1890 to 1929. If there's a number of books being written in that area, it's worthwhile to have a code for it. And by the way, if any of these codes, in theory, applies the period, you should use them. So if you have a book about 1890 to 1929, you actually should go to this code and use it. And you can ask yourself whether or not the progressive era is going to influence people's use of your subject code or not, because that's my worry about it. That's why I think plain subject code, plain time codes make so much more sense. Moving down the list, education is an interesting list. List 4 is education. Now, if you look at this list, what you're going to quickly find is that different countries have national curriculums and other countries don't. Canada doesn't, the United States doesn't. I would say that this list is really purpose-driven for countries that have national curriculums. And now we're going to contradict ourselves by going down this list and discovering that there are Canadian national codes available here. So here's a bizarre list which was actually proposed by Quebec for Canada, and it gives what seems to me to be a strange list of values that don't necessarily mean an awful lot, but are perfectly meaningful sorts of things. I mean, if nothing else, you can actually say there's a need potentially to identify elementary education, secondary education, college, and things. So you can do it for Canada in these very broad categories. And then I think because they realized they named it for Canada and that in effect they wanted it to be a national list for themselves, Quebec then proposed and added a Quebec specific list, which is identical to the one for Canada. Go figure. It's just how things work in our country. It's still, both of these things are still very useful groupings, and I'm glad that they're here, but that explains why there are some specific groupings within here. Moving down, you get the most useful list, I think, qualifier list in some ways. I mean, but it's also the strangest. It's list 5, which is interest groups. Now, similarly, you get kind of an odd thing. We're ONIX implementers, early ONIX implementers, and ONIX supports audience range coding. So I don't really understand why there's so much coding available, but other countries have put this under subject coding under these sorts of things. So they're giving these groupings in. Now, if you're trying to sell into another market, you should be aware of that and probably provide this coding. If it's Canada or the United States you're selling into, I would say you should be using audience ranges, and if you want, you can supplement it using this. I don't know. It's up to you to decide whether or not that's worthwhile. I would say don't stop using ONIX because nobody's expecting to see it in here. Do what people expect. No one is set up to process this information yet. So follow the rules for other countries, and in Canada and the United States, follow the ONIX audience ranges. When you get down to a little bit further, there's some merchandising codes. Again, BISAC supports a very similar list to this. You've probably not been using it. It's never been used by many people. I think that's stupid. People should be using this list. If you have a book that sells for some reason at Thanksgiving, or it's Halloween themed and you expect sales at Halloween, that's this list's purpose. It's here because the book sells at this time. It's a merchandising code. It is of interest to retailers because this is when it sells. So it's list 5 is the exception list. Everything else in Thema relates to the book's subject. List 5 relates to values that relate more to the book. So maybe to answer a different question than the one about where the author is from, Let's say it was a Black American author. How would you get that into here? Because that's a value people do want to know, or Indigenous, and so on. Well, this is where you would go to find that, because this is where there are related to various groups and things. And this is actually an area where our national committee is looking into right now to try and enhance. But if it's a Black U.S. author, the Great Britain and the U.S. have got values in here for relating to people. Canada is developing a similar sort of list at the moment. There's also relating to gays. This is again an area where it's growing, but it's getting to be a fairly decent list. Notice how these codes change. I mean, I find it slightly offensive that as you move down this list, when you get gay, the next thing on the list is it contains explicit material, because it seems to relate the two. But actually, relating to gender identity and things like this is a whole different group. So it goes from religion 5P to relating to gay, lesbian, bisexual people 5PS. Then it gets into 5PSB, 5B, 5P. 5X is quite a different code than 5P. So although it winds up next to each other, the two are clearly separated by the code values. 5X is X because it's explicit. It's a good code for that. Nothing to do with the list that came before it. So this is one of the weird things about when you look at lists. People get upset about stuff like that. People are kind of get vaguely queasy and offended. But in general, when you're looking at a list like this, you try to relate to it as being it's a code value and not worry too much about it. So I'm going to go back up to the US list and just look at the value that upsets people in Canada. There is something in here the US has chosen relating to Native American people. Native American is probably not preferential terminology. However, it's a US choice. This code is used in the US. My recommendation is use the code. Don't include the subject heading in your thing if it bothers you, and try not to think about it. We are adding or working to add a code into this list relating to Indigenous people. We don't want it to be specific to Canada. We want to have Canadian codes based off of that list. It's one of the things that we're working on adding at the moment. So again, this list develops. We try to pay attention to the politics. We're trying to do it properly. Just quickly, style is the last list. Style is really simple in concept. The Spanish people asked for it, and that's basically because, like if you have a book on architecture, Art Deco, I mean, the Art Deco is a time period, and Art Deco is a style. They want to have a separate list for style. So Baroque, you could have a Baroque romance. You could have a Regency romance. You can have a conceptualism romance probably as well. I mean, all of these things potentially could be used within fiction of some sort, but I mean, in general, they're here to try and allow architecture, art, and other things to be able to use a term without necessarily referencing the time period. You see the problem between time period and why I brought up Regency. Well, one last thing I'm just going to quickly look at, because it's here, and if you're still here, then you've paid the price for admission here, is I did do a quick study. It wasn't a quick study. I'm sorry, actually, I did also promise. This is the Bisactor Thema translator. Just quickly, as far as you can tell, nobody's having difficulty using it. It's very straightforward. There's a simple thing. You put BISAC codes in, you get responses back out. 1.3 is not being supported yet, so I would put off work in it until that is. Should be quite soon. There's that, which you saw. The last thing I wanted to show just very quickly is what data is looking like when I look at it in BISAC, in BiblioShare, I should say, when I actually check the data in BiblioShare, what's going on? Well, we have about 110,000 records with Thema codes. We have around 6,700 digital records using Thema codes. So about 115,000 total. So we're getting far more in print than we are getting in digital. That's an interesting question. Another thing that is just another number in here that's sort of important to see. Actually, it's not highlighted in here, but Canadian authorship. We would expect to have most records by Canadian authors having a Thema code in them, and frankly, we only have around 10 to 15%. That means an awful lot of Canadian publishers aren't actually supporting Thema yet, and we would ask all Canadian publishers to be using Thema because it's important. In terms of just what would retailers expect if you interrogate the data, this is the number of Thema codes in a single entry. So about 20% only have a single code. That seems to me to be awfully low. So that's a bit unfortunate. Fortunately, around 50%, over 50%, have 2 to 4. And another 20% on top of that. So the majority of books, over 70%, are between 2 and 9 entries. And then it rapidly drops off. And we actually have 2 books that have above 30 codes used in it. And that's just complete madness. Neither of the books come from a Canadian publisher. We do get some British data in. It's the Brits who are doing the weird stuff like that. As a matter of fact, I don't think anything... There may be some records in through here.
Can I jump in with a quick question?
Yes.
From Kathy. If we use Thema and BISAC, do we also need BIC?
I don't know. Okay. No, I would say because BIC has formally adopted Thema. On the other hand, I'm not an expert on BIC practice at the moment. So to the best of my knowledge, you should be able to use Thema because that's what BIC has basically said they're adopting and has adopted to the best of my knowledge. So it should be fine to use Thema. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of legacy data still using BIC. And like many things, have all British retailers adopted Thema? It kind of depends. I would not spend an awful lot of time doing BIC coding at this point, because you should be seeing Thema adoption happening rapidly in the UK if it isn't already good now. So it would depend on your needs. And if I had US sales representatives, I'd ask them, because they would know more than I do. And if you get a clear answer from one of them, tell me, because I would really appreciate it.
One more from Jackie. Sure. Have you seen any common errors when people are attempting to apply Thema codes? For example, using some of the sublists in lieu of main subject. You mentioned noticing applying Canada to everything. Anything else like that?
Well, funnily enough, I have a report on that. Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, one good piece of news I pulled up from BiblioShare is we've got over 380,000 individual Thema entries. And if you just take the value and match it against the Thema code list, which, by the way, the Thema code list does not yet have, it's not like BISAC yet, where each year the BISAC codes actually physically change and things get dropped and things. Pretty much everything that was in the initial list remains in the initial list. So you don't have too much trouble with that, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that to remain 100% true. So only 103 of the codes weren't matching against the thing. So virtually everything could just be run directly against the code list as it appears in the code. That means that when you're using a qualifier list, the list number is included. Just because ONYX gives you the opportunity to isolate each list individually doesn't mean you can drop the list number. always include the list number, the same value that's sitting in the Excel spreadsheet or in the notation thing. Use the whole thing, please. One of the biggest problems I can see in the list was when you listed Canada, a lot of people included the -CA or the -CA-. Submitting multiple codes in a single entry was another favorite thing. Don't do that. Each code value is each value in subjects is a single entry. That's different from keywords. Keywords is where you put all the codes all the words you're doing in a single value under subject heading text. So keywords is different. It's the one sort of area where you repeat things in subject. Everything else in subjects, there's a subject code where it says code. You use subject code, single entry, one at a time. So those are some favorite sorts of things. Lots of people provide books without a main subject. 17%. Okay. Lots of people provide okay, but 82% actually did provide a subject entry. That's good. 22% provided multiple subject entries. 18% provided a subject entry with a qualifier list. So these are all common mistakes. And 6 main subjects out of the list were supplied as a qualifier. So 2 physical and 4 digital books. So they basically didn't provide a main subject in the normal tense of the word.